The Brutal Face of Global Power, a philosophical analysis of the US operation against Maduro. The alleged US attempt to capture or forcibly remove Nicolás Maduro should not be read merely as a tactical foreign policy maneuver. Rather, it represents a revealing moment in the ontology of global power, one in which strength no longer seeks legitimacy through law, but instead reshapes law to fit its own will. What is at stake here is not simply Venezuela or Maduro himself, but the ethical and philosophical foundations of the contemporary international order. At the core of this event lies a familiar but unsettling logic: might precedes right. The United States, acting as a self-appointed global arbiter, determines legitimacy retroactively. First, a leader is declared illegitimate, criminal, or a threat to global stability. Only then is extraordinary action justified. Law thus ceases to function as a boundary for power and becomes instead its rhetorical instrument. In this sense, global politics regresses toward what Thomas Hobbes described as the pre-legal condition, where authority defines justice rather than the other way around. This logic becomes clearer when viewed through Carl Schmitt's concept of the state of exception. Sovereignty, Schmitt argued, belongs to whoever decides when normal rules no longer apply. In targeting Maduro, the United States implicitly declares Venezuela an exception, an entity temporarily excluded from the protections of sovereignty and international norms. Yet the danger of the exception is its tendency to normalize itself. Once the suspension of rules becomes routine, sovereignty turns conditional, granted only to those states that remain ideologically aligned with dominant power. The manner in which this power is exercised is as significant as the act itself. The operation's openly coercive character reflects a shift in the aesthetics of power, where empire once relied on diplomacy, ambiguity, and institutional mediation. It now increasingly favors visibility, spectacle, and intimidation. Power no longer whispers, it performs. This aligns with Michel Foucault's insight that modern power does not merely repress, it displays itself in order to discipline, deter, and produce obedience. From an ethical perspective, the operation marks a profound rupture. Kantian moral philosophy insists that human beings must never be treated solely as means to an end. Yet global power politics operates on a distinctly Machiavellian calculus, where outcomes sanctify methods. Whether one supports or opposes Maduro's governance becomes secondary. What matters is the precedent established. If leaders can be abducted, hunted, or externally removed at will, then political disagreement is no longer resolved through norms, but through force. Ultimately, this episode revives a fundamental philosophical question: is the international system governed by the power of law or the law of the powerful? If legality is applied selectively, if sovereignty depends on obedience, and if ethics dissolve under strategic necessity, then the promise of a rule-based global order stands exposed as a fragile illusion. From the perspective of philosophical logos, the US action is not an anomaly, but a symptom. It reveals that despite modernity's moral vocabulary, human rights, democracy, international law, global politics remains haunted by its most archaic impulse: domination. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: what is presented as an exception today may well be the blueprint for tomorrow's norm.
The brute face of hegemony, the U.S. Maduro case, and the philosophy of power. In the modern world, law is often merely the legalized will of the powerful. The United States seizure of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro's aircraft, combined with wanted posters and multi-million-dollar bounties, is far more than a routine geopolitical maneuver. It raises a profound philosophical question: is the greatest power under the sun above the law? This stance tears away the etiquette of diplomacy, revealing the most naked and brute form of power. Here is the philosophical anatomy of this arrogant approach and the dark corridors of global hegemony. 1. The return of Thrasymachus. Justice is the interest of the stronger. In the first book of Plato's immortal work, The Republic, the sophist Thrasymachus harshly challenges Socrates' idealistic definitions of justice. Justice is nothing but the interest of the stronger. The U.S. attitude toward Maduro serves as a modern, digital age proof of this ancient thesis. Washington treats international law not as a global common ground, but as an extension of its own domestic law. By seizing the assets of a sovereign state, it sends a message to the world. The world is my courtroom, and I am the judge. This is the surrender of the claim to universal law before the particularism of raw power. 2. Brute power and the logic of exceptionalism. At the ontological core of American foreign policy lies the philosophy of American exceptionalism. This belief posits that the U.S. is a morally superior power tasked with saving the world and exporting democracy. However, this messianic mission often manifests as a reckless and brute force. As Carl Schmitt noted in his theory of the state of exception, Ausnahmezustand, the sovereign is not the one who makes the rule, but the one who decides when to suspend it. If a leader like Maduro resists this global system, the hegemon strips them of their head of state status and demotes them to the level of a criminal. This is a tactic of dehumanization and delegalization. Once you declare your rival a criminal, any brutality used against them is cloaked as justified intervention. 3. The brutality of the Leviathan, from protector to punisher. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan describes a structure that holds absolute power to prevent social chaos. In the global system, the U.S. has assumed the role of a global Leviathan. But while Hobbes' Leviathan derives its legitimacy from providing security, today's structure has shifted from a protector to a global punisher, seizing the aircraft of another nation's leader like a privateer, or placing a bounty on a president's head, as if in a Western movie, is the point where the language of diplomacy ends and raw power is philosophically sanctified. At this stage, power has lost its ability to generate consent and has focused solely on instilling fear. 4. Hegel and the master-slave dialectic, a war for recognition. In Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic, the struggle between two consciousnesses is a life-and-death battle for recognition. The master wants to be recognized by the slave, but does not recognize the slave as an equal subject. The U.S. attitude toward Venezuela is a reflection of this one-sided desire for recognition. The hegemon recognizes the sovereignty of other states only as long as they submit. Maduro's existence is a barrier to this absolute desire for recognition. Therefore, the pressure applied is not just a quest for regime change. It is an effort to restore the shaking prestige of hegemony, reminding the world who the master is. 5. A display of power or a sign of decline. From a historical perspective, empires often become most brute during their period of decline. The Roman Empire, as it began to lose control of its borders, exhibited harsher and more reckless governance in its outlying provinces. When discussing the Thucydides trap, the question we must ask is, why does the hegemon become so reckless? Because when soft power, the ability to persuade and attract, fades, only hard power remains. The U.S. actions against Maduro are, in fact, a bitter declaration that the rules-based international order is being dismantled by its own architect. One who breaks their own rules eventually destroys their own legitimacy. 6. Conclusion. The law of the jungle or the law of humanity. The Maduro case proves once again that international relations are essentially a Nietzschean will to power. The strong man defines himself not only by his weapons, but by his audacity to violate the rights of others. Yet philosophy teaches us this: any power that ruthlessly tramples its own principles prepares the intellectual and moral ground for its own end. In the world of tomorrow, this brutality sows the seeds of global mistrust and chaos far beyond the small victories it wins today. Ultimately, brutality is not the pinnacle of power, it is the bankruptcy of creativity and diplomacy.